According to the Barbarossa Plan, the capture of Moscow was expected within the first 3 to 4 months of the war. The German command prepared a major offensive operation codenamed Typhoon. The offensive involved the 2nd Panzer Army under Guderian, which had become available after the defeat of Soviet forces near Kiev. The new plan called for 3 thrusts instead of the originally intended 2. Now their forces were directed toward Bryansk, Vyazma and Orel, with the prospect of advancing toward Tula. The operation's objective was to destroy the main forces of the Red Army defending Moscow before the onset of winter. To achieve this, it was planned to split the Soviet defenses with 3 powerful strikes by panzer groups, encircle and destroy the Soviet armies in the areas west of Vyazma and east of Bryansk, and then use strong mobile formations to flank Moscow from the north and south. In coordination with the troops advancing frontally, the goal was to capture the capital of the Soviet Union. The Germans had good reason to anticipate their long-awaited victory. A total of 64 divisions were committed to the assault on Moscow, including 16 panzer and 6 motorized divisions, with an overall force strength of 1.8 million men. The Red Army faced this onslaught with 14,000 guns and mortars, 1,320 aircraft, and roughly 2,000 tanks. Opposing this formidable host were 83 divisions of the Western Bryansk and Reserve fronts, totaling 1.25 million troops. They had only about 1,000 tanks and 71 artillery regiments, supplemented by 9 cavalry divisions and some reserve units. Clearly, the Germans held a significant numerical superiority. The final decisive battle was to take place near Moscow, marking the culmination of the entire eastern campaign. However, the stubborn Soviet defense at Smolensk and lagging flank advances forced the German command to halt the offensive on the Soviet capital. The Germans underestimated the depth of Soviet resistance. Near Smolensk, encircled units continued fighting, tying down as many as 20 Wehrmacht divisions. As in most defensive operations of 1,941, the main problem for the Red Army troops was the uncertainty of the German command's plans. It was expected that the Germans would advance on Moscow along the Smolensk Highway, as this facilitated the movement of thousands of motorized columns. However, during the battle for Moscow, the German command decided to bet on surprise and secretly redeployed General Colonel Erich Goepner's 4th Panzer Group from the Leningrad front. For the first time in history, 3 armored groups operated simultaneously on the same front. The Soviet forces defending Moscow were consolidated into 3 fronts: the Western Front under General Colonel Konev, the Bryansk Front under General Colonel Yeryomenko, and the Reserve Front commanded by Marshal Borodino. Operation Typhoon commenced in the early hours of the 30th of September 1941. The German panzer groups under Guderian and Heppner launched their southern thrust near Bryansk. Employing bypass tactics rather than frontal assaults, Wehrmacht forces penetrated Soviet rear areas and within 3 days achieved the complete encirclement of Yeryomenko's Bryansk front main forces. Orel fell on the 3rd of October. Facing this crisis, the Soviet High Command authorized encircled units to execute independent breakout operations while concentrating all available reserves on the Mozhaisk defensive line. On 12, the 16th of October divisions managed to escape the pocket, though subsequent breakout attempts resulted only in scattered groups of survivors emerging. Many trapped units transitioned to guerrilla warfare, with some not rejoining regular forces until the winter of 1941-1942. Exploiting the breach in Soviet lines, German panzers surged toward Tula. Guderian's deep penetration forced the Red Army command to take emergency measures. An airborne detachment was rapidly deployed to Orel, where paratroopers seized the Orel-Mtsensk highway and engaged advancing Wehrmacht spearheads. Reinforcements soon arrived in the form of T-34 tanks under Colonel Katakov's command. Near Mtsensk, Katakov orchestrated an ambush, allowing Guderian's vanguard units to advance before striking unexpectedly from the flanks and rear. The Soviet tank commander employed roving guns tactics, anti-tank artillery that shifted positions after firing several rounds, creating the illusion of strong defensive positions. According to Soviet records, Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade destroyed 133 German armored vehicles in the Mtsensk engagements. The time bought by Katukov's brigade proved crucial for reinforcing Tula's defenses. When Guderian's forces subsequently assaulted the city, the attack ultimately failed. Meanwhile, the time had come for the main offensive. The armoured groups and field armies of Army Group Center launched an assault on the reserve western fronts near Roslavel and Dukovshchina. German tank wedges broke through our defences and surged toward each other. Within 2 days, the encirclement was complete. 5 Soviet armies were trapped near Vyazma. In total, around 2/3 of all our forces in the western direction were surrounded near Bryansk and Vyazma. After defeating 3 Soviet fronts, on the 10th of October, German troops advanced toward Kalinin and by the 17th had captured the city, while the next day, Mozhaysk and Maloyoroslavets were abandoned. At the same time as the scale of the situation became clear, Stalin summoned General Zhukov from besieged Leningrad. Upon arriving at the front and quickly assessing the situation, Zhukov reached a grim conclusion. The defensive front in the western direction was effectively gone. All roads to Moscow were essentially open. After the war, Zhukov recalled, "When I am asked what stands out the most from the war, I always reply, the Battle of Moscow. There, the fate of Russia was decided." The last line of defense on the way to the city was the Mozhaysk line, which was under construction 120 kilometers from the capital. To defend these positions, Zhukov sent all the combat-ready units he could find in Moscow, ordered the construction of 3 lines of fortifications, utilizing anti-tank ditches and hedgehogs, as well as dug-in tanks as stationary firepoints and minefields on all tank-threatened approaches. Strengthened discipline with order number 0345 dated the 13th of October. Cowards and panic-stricken soldiers who abandoned the battlefield, withdrew without permission from their positions, or discarded their weapons and equipment were to be shot on the spot. Formed assault groups from the last remaining tanks, T-34S, and cavalry, which were deployed to the most dangerous sectors, where they held off the enemy for 2 to 3 Dalton's Pines until reserves arrived. Most importantly, he insisted on the redeployment of 30 fresh divisions from the Far East, following intelligence reports regarding Japan's neutrality. By mid-October, the intelligence of Army Group Center was already anticipating victory. However, the German motorized units that had broken through encountered unexpected and stubborn resistance from Soviet forces along the Mozhaysk line. On the same Borodino field, where the decisive battle against Napoleon's Grand Army took place in 1812, fierce fighting resumed in October 1941. Soviet soldiers occupied the same heights that the Russian army had held in 1812, just as they had a century earlier. The 32nd Rifle Division, commanded by Colonel Polasukin and arrived from the Far East, fought against the elite thugs of the SS Motorized Division, Das Reich, commanded by SS Obergruppenführer and SS General Paul Hauser. The positional battles on the Mozhaysk line of defense lasted several days, during which both the SS troops and Soviet fighters suffered significant losses. The infamous Nazi Paul Karel wrote, "At Borodino, the regiments first measured their strength against the Siberians. They fought steadfastly. They never fell into panic. They did not give up an inch of land without fierce fighting. They killed and died. The battle was fought not for life, but for death. Hell blazed on earth." German General Paul Hauser lost one eye, a reminder of the battle on the Borodino field. Near Maloyoroslavets, at the Ilyinsky defensive line, the Podolsk cadets waged a desperate stand. Armed only with carbines and machine guns and, virtually without logistical support, these military cadets held the advancing Germans for nearly 2 weeks. After days of brutal combat, enemy forces managed to advance only 300 meters. When frontal assaults failed, German panzers attempted to outflank the cadets' positions. They immediately came under devastating fire from 85mm anti-aircraft guns deployed in direct fire mode. These heavy weapons, originally allocated for Moscow's air defense, had been urgently repositioned to the front line. By mid-October, the Red Army had managed to bring the front to a state of unstable equilibrium. A report from the headquarters of the 57th Panzer Corps of the Wehrmacht stated that the last battles for the capture of Russian positions were the fiercest of the entire campaign in Russia, as the enemy was putting up fierce resistance, having entrenched themselves in concrete fortifications built during peacetime. In turn, the troops of the newly formed Kalinin Front under Konev halted the advance of the German 9th Army. Konev employed a clever tactic. At night, his unit simulated preparations for an offensive with the noise of engines and false radio communications, forcing the Germans to keep their forces in place. Large forces of Army Group Center were tied down in decisive battles with the surrounded Soviet armies near Vyazma and Bryansk during the critical days of mid-October 1941. During the fighting against the surrounded units and divisions of the Red Army, the Germans lost valuable time and were now forced to navigate the muddy roads that had become impassable after the rains. Subsequently, von Bock noted with frustration that the troops of Army Group Center were gradually getting stuck in mud and swamps. Later, the failures of the October offensive by the Wehrmacht towards Moscow were attributed solely to weather conditions. However, it was evident that the muddy roads after the rainy period negatively affected both opposing sides equally. By the beginning of November 1941, the front on the approaches to Moscow had gained sufficient stability. However, it was still too early to speak of the success of the defense of Moscow. On the 7th of November, the anniversary of the October Revolution, a military parade was held on Red Square in Moscow. Many participants in the parade went directly to the front lines from the square. The parade had immense political significance as it demonstrated to the Soviet government and personally to the Supreme Commander their determination to fight to the end. Less than a week after the parade on Red Square, the troops of the German Army Group Center received orders to resume the offensive on Moscow. With the onset of cold weather in mid-November, the ground froze, allowing tanks to move off the roads. The divisions at the forefront of the Army Group Center's offensive were provided with warm uniforms. The order from the 4th Panzer Group noted, "The days of waiting are over. We can advance again. We have only to destroy the last line of defense of Moscow." By the beginning of the new German offensive, the defense of Moscow had been significantly strengthened. Intelligence data allowed divisions to be withdrawn from the Far East. These units were transported via the Trans-Siberian Railway under conditions of strict secrecy. Even the commanders of the trains did not know the final destination. Meanwhile, the German command, due to the losses incurred, considered the plan to encircle Moscow unrealistic. The 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups were being concentrated on the left flank of Army Group Center in the area of Kalinin and Volokholamsk. Their objective was to push the Soviet troops back to the Lama River, capture the crossings in the western part of the Volga Reservoir, and advance towards the Moscow-Volga Canal. In the actual November offensive, instead of the traditional German tactic of encirclement battles, a simple breakthrough towards Moscow was carried out. On the 18th of November, the 2nd Panzer Group under Guderian was supposed to resume the offensive through Tula to the northeast towards Kolomna. A significant drawback of this plan was the choice of the main strike direction, which passed through a wooded area to the northwest of Moscow. This significantly limited the maneuverability of the German armored units. Nevertheless, the concentration of 2 panzer groups on a single axis proved decisive. After fierce fighting, the Red Army's defenses at Volokholamsk were breached. The 3rd Panzer Group, joined by elements of the 4th Panzer Group, advanced north of the Istra Reservoir toward Klin. Meanwhile, other units of the 4th Panzer Group pushed from Volokholamsk toward Istra. Critically, however, the Soviet front did not collapse, as it had during the October disasters. No comparable breakthrough occurred in mid-November. Under pressure from German panzer units, Red Army forces conducted a fighting withdrawal towards successive defensive lines at the Istra Reservoir and Klin. At this critical juncture, Lieutenant General Rokossovsky, commander of the 16th Army, received authorization from the General Staff to fall back to the Istra River line. However, when Marshal Zhukov, commanding the Western Front, learned of this order, he immediately countermanded the withdrawal and demanded forces hold their current positions at all costs. The dispute was ultimately decided by their German adversaries, Colonel Generals Heppner and Georg Hans Reinhardt, whose panzer groups outflanked the Istra Reservoir from the north. On the 24th of November, they captured Klin and Solnekhnegorsk, positioned just 50 kilometers northwest of Moscow. For German forces, this marked a significant tactical success. General Rokossovsky's units defending the Istra River line now faced imminent encirclement. Moreover, the capture of Solnekhnegorsk opened a potential northern axis for panzer and infantry divisions to strike directly at Moscow. Rokossovsky's army was soon forced to abandon its defensive positions along the reservoir. The final week of November saw ferocious combat as German divisions pressed their offensive. Simultaneously, Guderian's forces executed a wide envelopment of Tula, bringing Kashira under direct threat. Its fall would have cleared a path straight to the Soviet capital. However, Lieutenant General Belov's 2nd Cavalry Corps fighting dismounted as infantry with artillery support managed to halt the German armoured advance. In late November, forward German commanders could observe Moscow through binoculars. According to some reports, on the 30th of November, motorcycle troops from an Army Engineer Battalion even reached Kimkajust, 8 kilometers from Moscow's outskirts. The neighboring 3rd Panzer Group under Reinhardt reached the Moscow-Volga Canal, while elements of its right flank captured Krasnaya Polyana, just 30 kilometers from central Moscow. To the west, the front line had remained static since early November. In the south, Guderian's forces bypassed Tula, seized Venev, and advanced to Kashira's outskirts. But there, the German offensive ground to a halt. Their offensive capabilities were completely exhausted by this stage. The stage was now set for the Soviet counteroffensive. Fresh reserve armies began deploying to the front lines. The Red Army launched localized counterattacks as early as the 27th of November near Kashira and the 29th of November north of Moscow, striking at German, southern and northern groupings respectively. Then, on the 5th of December, 3 Soviet fronts launched a full-scale counteroffensive. For first-hand accounts of these battles, see the German officers' memoirs featured on my channel, link in the description. In the ensuing operation, Wehrmacht forces were pushed back 100 to 350 kilometers from the Soviet capital. 3 days after the Red Army launched its Moscow counteroffensive, Hitler was compelled to sign Directive No. 39, ordering the Wehrmacht's transition to defensive operations across the entire Eastern Front. The Battle of Moscow marked the German army's first major defeat since the beginning of World War II. In his assessment of the campaign, General Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff of the German Fourth Army, acknowledged, "This was the turning point of our Eastern campaign. Our hopes of knocking Russia out of the war in 1941 collapsed at the final moment." Notably, he omitted that at Moscow, the Wehrmacht first encountered innovative Soviet tactics. Commanders had mastered not only defensive operations, but also launched precision strikes against unprepared enemy positions.